Most South Koreans want democracy over prosperity this Christmas and beyond, while outside their borders, interest has been reignited over the country's hangover recovery drinks as end-of-year celebrations take place across the world. With more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Friday, December 26th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we cover a number of stories about Koreans and their wish for the country and the remedy for hangovers given the wining and dining to bid farewell to 2025. For more on this, our freelance journalist Raphael Rashid here in the studio. Raphael, hope you had a great Christmas.
Thank you.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with us. Colin, how was your Christmas?
First Christmas with twins, with infant twins, so, you know, we gave them a few things, but don't have to give them too many things because they don't know it's Christmas. That's okay.
Still infants, right?
Yes.
Okay, Raphael, we should start with you. As I mentioned in the short clip before our talk, South Koreans have been found to favor mature democracy as their #1 wish for South Korea over economic prosperity. Now, reportedly, this is the first time that democracy has taken over prosperity in the 30-year history of this annual poll on public perception. What are your takeaways, Raphael?
Yeah, I think this is quite a historic shift. As you mentioned, this is the first time in 30 years that they've been doing this survey. It's carried out by the Ministry of Culture. And yeah, the survey shows that mature democracy secured 31.9% compared to economic prosperity at 28.2%. Of course, this is, you know, a small difference in percentage points, but still significant nonetheless. The Culture Ministry, actually, some officials went on record anonymously saying that they attributed this to heightened public awareness following recent experiences of democratic strain. So, of course, I think the reference here is clear. It encompasses last December's martial law crisis when former President Yoon declared martial law and deployed troops to the National Assembly. And of course, that was reversed within a few hours. So I think simply put, his subsequent impeachment and you know, this basically provided Koreans a kind of reminder of the democratic fragility, you know, that we can't take democracy for granted and that democracy is forever evolving. It's an ongoing process and that Koreans shouldn't be taking democracy for granted, something that they need to fight for every day. But just maybe one final thought is that I think there's also an element of conflict fatigue. When we do look at the figures in this survey, they do show that 82.7% of this so-called, you know, progressive, conservative conflict, that is extremely severe. And then we also see gender conflict rose from about 50% to around 60% since 2022. And then we also have regional tensions also increased from 57.4% to 69%. So I think when people talk about this mature democracy, I think they're also asking for a system where they can manage this polarization of society.
Right, indeed. Colin, what are your thoughts regarding this shift in public perception from prosperity to democracy? Is it something you've been perhaps observing on the ground?
Well, it's something I've been thinking about for a long time because, in part, when I was first getting to know Korea, before I even came here, Koreans would tell me, Koreans themselves would say, oh, you know, Koreans are more concerned with raising the standard of living, with prosperity, with the economy. Like, they care about democracy, but, you know, maybe later. Maybe it's for later. We'll worry about the sort of niceties of democratic government. First, just get the economy built up. So, if that's true, then I suppose we can tell a fairly straightforward story here, that the economy has been growing for quite a while in Korea. It used to be growing very fast. And now that we've reached a certain point in Korea, it's time to change the view to more questions of governance and participation in government and how will this country be run? Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. Another is the issue of national prestige. And oftentimes Korea will be ranked as a sort of, I think The Economist has used the term is it problematic democracy or partial democracy? In any case, it's a democracy with a sort of asterisk in many cases, that yes, this is one of the democracies of the world, and it belongs in those rankings, but there are certain problems that pop up or conditions that may not exist in other countries that have been democratic for a longer period of time. So I think for many Koreans, that is sort of felt as the country being not quite there, in the sense of not quite having the full respect of that league of nations in the world, to put it that way. And so I think back to a piece written by P.J. O'Rourke, the American humorist / reporter. In the late 80s, he came here when there were so many student demonstrations, student protests, in the name, ostensibly, of democracy. And in this piece, he pulls over one of the students who's participating. And he says, asks amid the tear gas, what do you want? And he says, democracy. He asks, why do you want democracy? Oh, it's better. Why is it better? It's more democratic that way. So I think that circularity is still somewhat telling here. Democracy is one thing, but I think that it's seen as a form of national prestige. There are the democracies and the non-democracies, and the latter are lesser countries in the eyes of many people. And so it's less to do with what the political system is than sort of where it ranks in global perception. So that's something as well. I think we have to balance those two. And the Lee Jae-myung administration has made many noises about being more open, more participatory, but I wonder how many people, how many Koreans or citizens of any country really want to participate themselves more in the day-to-day governance of the country. I don't think they do. I think in any case, they might want actually less involvement with the sort of squabbles, anyway, that go on in the state. So let's bear that in mind as well while evaluating these survey findings.
Right, and staying with surveys, Raphael, a poll of foreign residents who've been living in South Korea for over 2 years shows that more than half are happy and satisfied with life here. Now, this particular ratio, it's higher than that of South Koreans. How do you explain this discrepancy?
Yeah, actually, this survey came from the same one that we just discussed from the Ministry of Culture, the so-called survey on Korean attitudes and values. And this year, they actually, looked for the first time at they pulled around 1,000 foreigners and asked their opinions. And so we have 55.9% of foreign residents saying that they're feeling generally happy, and 56.1% say that they're satisfied with their lives, higher than that of Koreans at 51.9% and 52.9% respectively. I think this, there are several factors, I think, that can maybe explain this. For, I think, many of us foreigners living in Korea, Korea, I think, offers something genuinely refreshing, and also, I guess, at least for me and for many of my friends, it's a remarkably, or at least comparatively, safe country to be in. You don't need to kind of look over your shoulder at night. In big cities, of course, we have to be careful wherever we are. Healthcare access, of course, I think is extremely important. Just the other day, I had my compulsory, comprehensive health screening that is free every 2 years. And I think, these small things do help, especially maybe in other countries where a medical emergency might bankrupt certain people. So I think, we can understand the appeal here, of course, infrastructure, digital services, administrative processes. But I think perhaps more importantly here, foreign residents measure their satisfaction against different baselines. So our home countries or alternative destinations, whilst Koreans themselves will be comparing their situation to kind of evolving expectations of what Korean society needs to provide for them. So I think the baselines here are very different from what people are comparing. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything is beautiful for everyone, and this survey also did highlight that around 44% of foreign residents reported experiencing discrimination, primarily based on their country of origin, followed by language proficiency and appearance. But of course, then they said that their satisfaction in life was higher than locals. So I think that is also very telling.
Right, and staying with this survey, of course, Colin, the public believes that the government's priority should be tackling the gap between the rich and the poor. Keeping this in mind, how does Korea's thoughts for the country and priorities for the government compare with those of its counterparts elsewhere?
Right, it's one of those, it's another aspect, I would say, to, in a way, what Raphael was talking about, the perceptions of Korea within Korea and without Korea. They differ. And in this case, the inequality of Korean society is something that's often brought up in the discourse within Korea, often brought up as one of the worst qualities of the society. Is you have poor people and you have rich people and you have middle class people, and the differences are very stark in the Korean perception, in the domestic perception. But when you look at any quantifiable measure of the economic inequality in Korea, it doesn't rank that badly. For example, there's this number, the Gini coefficient, that does measure this. And it's not one of the most equal societies in the world, but nowhere near the bottom either. So this is something where the numbers or the sort of objective measures come up against a different story told by perhaps people's lives or how they feel in the day-to-day experience here. So that's one question to consider as well, is why does it feel so much more unequal, apparently, to Koreans than it seems actually to be? Now, the question of what the government, if anything, should do is separate, because when you're talking about reducing the gap between rich and poor, well, you can make the rich less rich, which is it doesn't have a good history. I will say that policies designed to do that have a way of causing problems you didn't anticipate. But the other side is, can you raise the bottom? And that, I think, is the more important question. What's going on at the bottom? A question from which the notion of inequality itself, inequality per se, is almost a distraction. And so I think if you look at comparable countries to South Korea, and you look at what's happening with the poorest of the poor, the situation doesn't look good in Korea, obviously, if that's the stratum you're looking at. But you will notice, if you come from a country like the US, there's there are many fewer people living on the street here than there are there, which is not to say there's no poverty here. There is poverty, but this is a question better defined in terms of sort of how do we raise the floor than lowering the ceiling or even squeezing the gap.
Right. Raphael, let's now move on to another issue of interest. December, as I mentioned earlier, is filled with wining and dining to mark the end of year. That being said, back in September, I believe, you covered South Korea's market for traditional hangover remedies. First of all, let's begin with that coverage. Do walk us through it.
Sure. I mean, and perhaps for those who may not be familiar with what these remedies are, if you walk into any convenience store or supermarket in South Korea, you'll find entire sections dedicated to these so-called hangover remedies, from kind of traditional drinks to these jelly sticks to some tablets or pills. And they're marketed as helping to relieve the next day hangover, and you consume these before or after drinking. And so, I've been very interested in this market because it really is booming and it is everywhere. And actually the market reached approximately 350 billion won in 2024, growing 10% annually. This is despite Koreans actually drinking less alcohol these days. Per capita alcohol consumption has been falling steadily since around 2015, and I think the pandemic also kind of accelerated this trend for young people basically going to the non-alcoholic equivalents. But this hangover market definitely is rising, and the industry actually centers around this herbal ingredient called Hovenia dulcis, forgive my Latin, and this is also known in Korean as hotge, or the Oriental raisin tree. So when I visited some traditional medicine market in Seoul, some vendors told me that this is a hot item these days, a hot ingredient, but actually it was little known around 18 or 20 years ago. It wasn't at all part of their sales, but now it's everywhere. So I did speak to some experts who did tell me that essentially calling it traditional might be a bit of a generous interpretation, as it does, if we go back in history, it was used, but it wasn't used as long as we think it was. But this this appeal extends, I think, beyond hangover prevention per se. Younger drinkers often buy these products, and it's basically become a kind of etiquette when you go out drinking to distribute these to your friends. Whether or not they work is it's a different matter, but I think it's a part of the kind of night out to hand these out, a kind of ritual. There is also regulatory scrutiny these days. New rules were implemented earlier this year, requires companies to conduct these human trials demonstrating measurable improvements in the hangover symptoms, and companies who are not able to provide this evidence basically face bans for making these marketing claims on the products. But I guess one final point I would say is that the actual scientific backing, clinical trials does remain limited, and there has been promising research in Korea and the region in laboratory settings with animals, but when it comes to human clinical scientific trials, the evidence is scarce and I think inconsistent for the time being.
Right, and regardless of that, though, it's quite popular here in the country.
Very popular.
Colin. Colin, as Raphael mentioned, drinking culture here in South Korea, it's changed, especially compared to a decade or so ago. How do you care to explain this change? I wonder, is it universal?
Well, I think anybody who's watching, who even if they haven't been to Korea, if they've watched Korean dramas or films, they'll know these scenes with tables in a restaurant or a pub when the green bottles have piled up, 10, 20, 30 empty green bottles, all bottles of soju, very much the national liquor, very cheap and effective in its way, if that's the effect you want. And there have been these articles talking about the fall of the kingdom of somek, or somek being soju and mekju, or beer, mixed together, which makes the soju go down a little easier. And it's been quite a popular drink here in Korea, and still is, I think, popular. But the market research reveals that among what's called the MZ sedae, the millennial and Z generation, born between 1980 and 2000, I believe, there's been a tendency toward either not drinking alcohol at all, which I think is a minor element here, or drinking sort of less or higher quality drinks. And somek is not, I mean, the individual components themselves are not very high quality. Typically, it's, the sort of average beer with the average soju, mix them together. But now there's a market for wine, which was here 10 years ago, but 20 years ago was not so much. Highballs, the Japanese interpretation of sort of whiskey sodas, are getting very popular here in Korea. You can't go, I mean, in my experience, you can't go to any neighborhood pub and not be offered a highball. So I think it's a taste difference. There's a sort of a generational shift in taste, but also health concerns and wanting to be able to go to work the next day, as Raphael mentioned. Hangovers and their sort of dubious cures are almost part of the culture here. So I think that all feeds into it. But I'd be surprised if we see mass abstention from alcohol entirely, especially as New Year's comes around. But I wouldn't be surprised if a focus toward quality, not quantity, becomes permanent.
Right. Raphael, beyond drinking, you also did a piece, I believe, on how South Korea's kimchi is being priced out. Could you tell us more?
Yeah, I think if you look at the economics, it's quite stark and troubling for Korean producers. Chinese kimchi sells to restaurants for about 1,700 won per kilogram, whilst Korean-made versions average 3,600 won, basically more than double the price. If we look at the trade situation, it's also quite bleak. In the first 10 months of the year alone, South Korea imported $159 million worth of kimchi, almost entirely, I think it's 99%, from China, whilst exporting $137 million worth of kimchi. So for an industry that is built around Korea as, this is the national dish, it's the signature ambassador of Korea. This, I think, represents both an economic and symbolic reversal. I spoke to some kimchi producers and factory owners. I visited a kimchi factory as well, and they describe watching local restaurants basically abandoning their products. They used to literally sell to the local community. Now they can't do that anymore. It's essentially sales online or to basically individual addresses or families. But basically, the restaurants are no longer buying Korean-made kimchi. Why? purely down to the price issue, cost pressures. One factory owner told me that many producers over the past decade have not been able to invest in facilities or expansion plans, and that if they don't go bankrupt, that's a success. That's how bad they're telling me it is. I think several factors are driving this. Of course, these days single-person households are on the rise. They comprise around 36% of all households, basically triple the rate from the year 2000. So whilst it reduces the kind of home kimchi production, it also increases the demand for commercial varieties and also eating out to get your fix of kimchi. And of course, you can't go to a restaurant in Korea and pay for kimchi. It will always come out for free. The climate crisis adds another pressure, another layer to this problem. Summer cultivation for certain cabbages, cabbage types have become increasingly difficult, especially in traditional highland growing areas where these cabbages normally grow. And we also have the wholesale cabbage prices sometimes doubling year on year during peak seasons. So I think this volatility makes Korean production even less, I guess, competitive against this industrial scale of Chinese operations. And I think we need to remember that a lot of the kimchi producers around the country are very small. They're not huge factories. I think it's around 3/4 of kimchi manufacturers operate these kind of micro businesses, only 3 or 4 people. So, when it's a very labor-intensive kind of industry, they struggle to compete against large-scale operations. So, I guess it comes down to a matter of kind of the economics of the situation. It's simply cheaper to buy from abroad.
Right, and it remains a very big concern, of course, for Korea as we speak. I'm afraid that's all the time we have, but as always, Raphael, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Colin, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, on that note, we say goodbye today. We return same time next Monday, so do join us then, and thank you for now.